Thank you so much for joining us today on our very first episode of the In Full Bloom Book Club series. Our first season is called Childish. In this season, the host will be exploring the topic of transformation and why it is important on a personal and societal level. Hosts will consider the wounds they brought into adulthood and the obstacles they faced.
In honor of Pride Month, we are excited to be reading our first book of the season, Heaven by Emerson Whitney. Later in the season, we will read Scorpionfish by Natalie Bakapoulos. Links to where you can find these books to follow along will be in the description box below.
And speaking of following along, we invite you all to join in on the discussions with us through our Book Club Facebook group. There, you will be able to connect with us and the entire community through topic engagements, challenges, and more.
We'd like to take a moment to provide a disclaimer that the views expressed by the hosts of the In Full Bloom Book Club series are not necessarily those held by In Full Bloom Media. Our hosts do not claim to be experts on the topics we discuss, but instead will express opinions derived from their own experiences.
The In Full Bloom Book Club is committed to exploring real issues that affect humanity. These conversations may be challenging and heavy, but we believe them to be necessary and hope they will be empathy cultivating and transformative for the host and for all of you. Please remember that these discussions are made for an adult audience, so view at your discretion. Thank you all again, and without further ado, enjoy the first episode.
Okay, y'all. So I'm so excited. It seems like you all are excited to get to the discussion as well.
Absolutely.
First, I would just want to get everyone's initial impressions. It's definitely interesting. It's an interesting read for me in a variety of ways. So I'm just excited about hearing everyone's initial impressions and thoughts on the novel.
So I think my initial reaction so far to reading it is that it's not something that you can read quickly. It is something that you need to read intentionally because you need to digest what's being said, because it's not, I don't feel that the author has written the book in a way that is just, you can take it for face value. I think that there's meaning behind, and there's a deeper connection to the text. I think that you have to uncover, that you don't get just from a quick read, that you have to be in it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I was looking back at like some of the first paragraphs of it and hearing and reading different parts of it at this point now, rather than when I was trying to just read through it at first and like start the book, you know. I also felt like it was a really difficult one for me to get into right away. Like I had hesitations with it because of the writing style and because it felt so jumpy. And I remember even saying like I couldn't tell if it was intentional jumpiness or just jumpiness for jumpiness sake. And then as I got more into it, I was like, oh, it flows so well. And it's so intentional in the way that it moves through the different stories and the different parts of the like philosophy that she's looking into and everything too. It really, I mean, I loved it. I'm really excited to keep reading it. It's so interesting.
There's a lot of piecing together these memories and piecing together, going back and forth between time. And that's really interesting. And then this set me off a little bit. I was like, oh, this is hard. There are no quotations. Right. That got me, y'all.
Yeah.
I was like, no. But so that was really interesting. It kind of forces you, right, to slow down, like Joshua was saying.
Yeah, it almost like provides to the flow that there's no quotations, because I don't think I even noticed it. It was almost like somebody telling a story about what somebody else had said, when they're just like, yeah, and then we were moving into the flow of what they had said as well. Yeah.
It definitely changes. So I went into it knowing that it was basically an autobiography, but when you think of if you've ever read an autobiography, there's kind of just the way this is set up, there's like somewhat of a traditional way of this being set up. And so starting off, I was just like, wow, this feels really strange. It was very poetic in the beginning, and I was like, okay, I don't know what's happening here, but I really enjoy what the author did with this book. It's different. It's very unique. It's very heady for me. Like, you're really like, I don't know, it's almost embodying that person, because it's like, that's true to who we are as people. We can be in our head a lot, and this thought comes in, and we're having these conversations in our heads, and we're like, oh, let me, this, I remember this from that, and I pulled these these sources, and that's really like, I feel like we just kind of embody the author in this space, and that's just really interesting to me. So I really like where this is going.
Yeah, it's very stream of consciousness, like
Right.
moving through it. Yeah, like cursive almost is how I read it in my head.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, sorry, Joshua, go ahead.
I feel like that's why there's not quotations though, because it's a thought.
Great.
Right.
Yeah.
Somebody remembering something,
Yeah.
and it's an internal, like, what do I want to say? It's almost as if we're in the author's head watching them rewatch the memory, if that makes sense.
No,
Like
really,
they're
it does.
reliving the vision, and we have the opportunity to sit with them and just watch it unfold as they recall it or as they wanted to recall it.
I think Whitney was quoted saying, and I think I read this in that book itself. I like can't talk about my life without making a mess of it, or something like that. You all remember that quote?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I think the intention was kind of, I want to start us off with messy, you know what I mean? A quote. So at one point, Whitney quotes, everything I fear in her lives hot inside of me, referring to their mother. And I took that to mean that Whitney finds that all the qualities that they fear about their mother, they also find within themselves, although I could imagine other interpretations as well. So tell me if someone else gathered something different from that quote. But I want to ask, can any of us relate? Have any of us discovered that we share some of the least appealing or even most intolerable qualities from our parental units or our caretakers, primary caretakers? Have we found those within ourselves, and what does that reckoning look like for everyone? Yeah, feel free to sit with it a little bit.
I think the answer to that question is an easy yes.
Yeah.
I think in the moment right now, wanting to share specifics makes me cautious about who might see this.
Yeah.
And how that might affect other people.
Yeah.
But I think like the easiest answer to this question is, of course there are.
Yeah.
And normally we don't like those things about ourselves, especially if we associate it as a negative trait of our parental figure, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be our mom or dad. It could be whoever raised us, right? But of course, I think those are always bad qualities, especially in this context. Now, I think that there are some good things that we can recognize that we have. Right? I wouldn't, in a public setting, right, be like, well, I got this from my mom, I got this from my dad, and I hate it about myself because I hate it about them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I hear that and respect that, of course.
Yeah. I specifically did not tell my parents I was doing this, so I could be honest for these questions, because not trying to be in the family grapevine of drama. But yeah, no, absolutely. And that's something that I'm like coming to realize more and more often, is those traits that made life chaotic when I was younger are still in me, and that the parts of me that fight those are also the parts of me that want to control everything about my surroundings and everything that is involved in my life. And it's a hard realization to come to, for sure, because it's like you said, it's usually the traits that you didn't want to have from them. And I always was a little aware of things. Like my dad and my sister are really red hot anger, and I'm right there with them. I have that short fuse that goes off really fast, and I burn out quick, but I'm really fast to get there. And I spent a lot of time working on that and trying to simmer it down so it's not so explosive when it blows up, but yeah, it's a hard one. And I think it's one that, like, in your 20s especially, you really start to realize, and you're just like, it's kind of that balance too between finding like the victim mentality of it, of like, my parents did these things to me and they gave these things to me, and woe is me, I feel so terrible about it. And then also taking responsibility and saying, these might be my traits and these might be things that came out of like my childhood and my parents' like personalities and everything, but now they're mine and now I have to take responsibility for them so that my children don't have to do this in the future too,
Right.
Yeah, it's that I'm really working on that balance because I definitely fall into that victim mentality quite often where I'm just like, nothing was fair and forget everybody and this is awful and woe is me. But yeah, it's that hard balance between the two.
Absolutely. I think it can also be an opportunity for empathizing with, your parents or your caretakers or, the different people in your life who you feel like temperaments were passed down. We all have traits that we're trying to, cope with and figure out how to show up, the best we can in the world with, what we have. And so, yeah, thank you all for sharing about that. Another kind of question delving into just thinking about our, what do you call it, like family of origin, thinking about our family of origin. And again, obviously share what you all feel comfortable sharing in the way that feels most comfortable for you all. But it seems like Whitney's life as a child felt pretty unstable. And their mom didn't seem to be the most consistent or reliable caretaker, again, from Whitney's point of view. And I imagine that over the course of our reading, we'll learn more about how that impacted Whitney and influenced their behavior. Are you all able to recognize specific dynamics in your relationships with your families of origin that influence kind of how you show up in the world today? And those can be, strained dynamics. Those can also be, strong and, fortified dynamics. So, yeah.
I did, absolutely. There's that codependency in that relationship between them where you can see how unhealthy it is, and you can see that the child is taking on way too much of the parental role and having to parent the parent, which should never happen. That it puts so much burden on a child, like that I've seen that in real life too, outside of books, and it is just so heartbreaking because it does just put such a heavy burden on a kid. And I definitely can see that within my family because we have a lot of siblings. I have 3 sisters and a younger brother. So there's 5 of us total. And my oldest sister absolutely had to take on that burden because we're a larger family, because we didn't grow up with a lot of money. She had to take on the burden of raising all of the kids behind her. But then also being the oldest, she had to take the brunt of the emotional immaturity of my parents. So she had to be the guinea pig essentially. And it's such a toxic element of a childhood to me, at least. I can't ever see it as a positive thing because I can see where it took her in her life and how that has now affected all of our relationships with her as well, where she had to take on this heavy role of being that oldest child. And it's led her down some dark paths, and it's led all of us to having to kind of isolate ourselves from her because, like I mentioned, she has that really explosive anger, and it's hard to be around. So it's just this weird dynamic that definitely absolutely happens within larger families a lot, but it's that codependency too, and that tug and pull between who's in charge and who's the enabler and who's the one doing the bad behavior and who's the one pushing the bad behavior, and all of those different dynamics that just are too complicated for a child to look at and experience in a way that could ever be positive for them.
What's happening is that the mother is looking to the child for the perception and the sense of consistency, because that's what they can't provide to their child. They can't provide the consistency, so they seek that out in their child, right? That's where that support's coming in. And I think that can be said for kids from divorced families. I'm from a divorced family. So, and I've always said that I never had an example of what a consistent relationship was like. Both of my parents are remarried, multiple times remarried, and have had several, romantic partners throughout my 30 years. And there was never consistency. Now, I think later in their own lives and in my own life, they have found consistent partners that they have been with both for over a decade at this point. But that wasn't always the same. And I think my parents couldn't provide consistency, but the one thing for them that was consistent was me, right? Like I was always there. They knew that was consistent. So I can see that reflected within the story that we're being presented with here in kind of this beginning phase of unfolding who we're talking about and kind of who's like being shared about.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I'm hearing the different things that you guys are saying, and I had to sit back for a moment because I have experienced this firsthand growing up, and I kind of had to just take a moment to reflect on that a bit. And you know, my situation, it wasn't on the extreme end of it where my mom was like, I was really like taking full care of her or anything like that. It wasn't to that extent, but there was a bit of a codependent relationship. She had, she was taking care of 4 kids, and she had me when she was like 17. So that I can imagine, her world is just like, oh, there's always something happening. And then you have, 4 girls you have to take care of, and you haven't lived enough, and there was kind of like this rotating door of events that would happen growing up. And I always felt this protective instinct over my sisters, so they didn't have to really know what was going on, but also my mother, because I witnessed a lot of the things that she had to endure, and I had to kind of be there like, it's okay, mom, we're going to get through this. I had to be that person. And hearing that, like, just kind of like reflecting on that, it was about consistency. It really was. Her having me, I had to kind of be not only the oldest, but like the good child, the child that can really make sure everything sticks together. For my mom, I really was that was how I operated. I was really in that position where I had to make sure everything's okay for her, and that, I can balance it all. And now thinking back to it, that can be a lot to take on. That was a lot to take on. And that kind of led me into my adult life, having this identity crisis. Like, if I'm, being out on my own, who am I without taking care of my mother and taking care of my sisters,
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for sharing, Asian. Again, I think when you're aware of those patterns, that's the first step to kind of being able to do something about it, and, create a system that works better for you. Because a lot of times I do think we get just caught up in the patterns that we, established before we were able to do so intentionally. I want to shift gears a little bit, you all. One reason that this book was selected for this season was because we anticipated it being a beautiful meld of personal reflection in the midst of social context. And I think so far, this novel beautifully weaves together the personal story of Whitney with just the realities of living amongst people and the social landscape. So Emerson or Whitney quoted so eloquently and so poetically, our everyday language creates a forgetfulness of what it seems like to be, what it feels like to be embodied. And I interpreted this quote as saying that we tend to think of ourselves as in control of our bodies, and as our bodies being an extension of ourselves, and not about our body's influence on us and ourselves as an extension of our body. So I pose a question to the group. How much do you all feel your identity, either in the way you see yourself or how others see you, is influenced by sex, gender identity, and gender expression?
About 85 to 90%. Yeah.
Well, and I really appreciated that this book is a look into what femininity means, because I think we all have all women have a really hard time with that, because we're told that things that are traditionally feminine are lesser than. I work in the tech industry. I don't look like I work in the tech industry. I'm an English major for one too. So a lot of the things that I am very into are traditionally feminine. And when I go into these all male spaces, I have to project something else so that they will respect me.
And I think sometimes that we talk about like who can be the smartest, who can be the best leader, but we associate those traits with masculine qualities of good men, right? And so it's almost like who can be this characterization of gender expression, if you will, type situation.
Mhm.
And I think what you all struggle with, what I'm hearing, is identifying as women in spaces with people who identify as men. I think being a queer man sometimes is probably not the same challenge that you experience, I would say, but definitely something that might be relatable, in that oftentimes as an openly queer, who sometimes I would consider myself like an effeminate feminine gay man, um people sometimes don't take me as seriously or consider me as qualified as a leader, and my sassiness is or my assertiveness is determined as being sassy and sarcastic. And it's like, you say the exact same stuff. I just
Mhm.
say it and it's quicker, so it's got like a little bit of a beat to it, and you take it as
Mhm.
being sassy, and I'm a sassy
Mm.
gay man. Yes, probably, but also like,
Yeah.
I'm just telling you kind of what we need to do type situation, you know? I think this text is about gender and sexual identity, or gender identity. And I think a lot of this is veering into this, a lot of our conversation today is veered into the identity as like a woman, born a woman, born
Gotcha.
female. And
Right.
the book is not necessarily about this. And I think all of this conversation we're having is valid and it's right,
Yeah.
but it's not the intended topic of the book. The book is on trans identity and
Mm.
understanding the shift in recognition and the shift in validation of that identity, and in recognizing and exploring that identity. And everything that we have said is vastly different for trans identified people, because they're
Yeah.
navigating into a space that they have to be one and the other and another,
Yeah.
and trying to
Mm.
figure that out for people who have no idea what trans is about. You know what I mean?
Well, and they have
Yeah.
to be very traditionally presenting either way. They either have to be very feminine presenting or very masculine presenting. But if you're in that middle ground where, you've either just started hormone therapy or you just don't want to present that way, then yeah, you're kind of shit out of luck in these spaces, unfortunately, because it's
Mm.
But even trans identity is a spectrum, right? Not everybody
right.
who's trans
Right.
chooses to transition, chooses to go on hormones, chooses to change any feature, chooses to present feminine or versus masculine. I mean, for some people, it's just saying I'm trans means they're trans.
Mhm.
Mhm.
For anybody, saying I'm
Yeah.
trans means that they're trans. It's how they identify. It doesn't
Right.
matter what kind of like society is constructed about what we need to do to validate the trans identity for people.
Yeah, thanks for
Gotcha.
pulling us back on track, because
Yeah,
we
for
were kind of
sure.
getting into
Yeah,
our own
really.
spaces on that.
Yeah, thank you all for that.
Mhm.
So I want to wrap us up with another conversation of identity. Whitney expressed a dichotomous understanding of their self as genderqueer, but also as exhibiting a lot of the physical characteristics of their grandmother, and recognizing that as a young age and kind of feeling a sense of pride attached to that. And we all hold multiple identities, right? So do any of you find conflicts with your different identities, whether that be, sex, gender identity, gender expression, um, ethnic or racial identity? Do you find conflicts with those identities, or find yourself having to grapple with the sometimes paradoxical nature of any of those identities?
Pinpointing what that might be on the spot is probably a challenge,
Mm,
unless you're still struggling with it. I think is a
mm,
really big thing. I think if you've been able to have the ability to work through some of this and kind of come to terms with some of the things that are not so great, or that like we wish we could change, um, and realizing maybe we can't change everything, but there are
yeah.
some things that make it worthwhile, is different. Um, I don't know. It's a tough one.
Yeah, for sure. And feel
Mhm.
free, you all, to kind of, think on that and reflect on that
Mhm.
for a moment if you feel, called to respond. I mean,
It speaks to the relationship between mothers and daughters too, because it's such a it's like that quote, like, is my body just mine? Because you grow up knowing like, oh, I'm going to look like my mom one day, and this is something that I should be like ready for and proud of. And what traits did I get from my mom, and what traits, did I get from my grandmother? Like, you're supposed to look at that matriarchal line and see like, what what you're supposed to be when you get older. So then to cut that, like to like change from being the daughter to being the son, it's a big adjustment for everyone, and it should be one that's accepted and easily accepted. But because we've put so much emphasis on that mother-daughter, I think it's hard for people to hard for like the connection to be made in a different way, I think, because it is just such an emphasis that I feel like is so much stronger than like the mother and son, or the, you know, father and daughter. Even like you're supposed to look like them, that's your body, you're ready for it, you know. Like like the boobs. Go ahead.
This was one of those places where is an example of where I was talking about, you have to, like, where I felt I had to read deeper, in that I have heard that interviews with trans people, or when people try to explain the trans experience, they were just born in the wrong body. I thought that this was like kind of talking about that narrative, but Whitney's realizing that they're trans, but they're born in the right body because their body's connected in a way to their grandmother. So it's not wrong, it's right. It's just doesn't match what they feel, is how I interpret it in my head. They're proud of their body because it connects them to their family. It connects them to their grandmother, who they have so much esteem for, but it doesn't match them as a person.
Right.
That's how I understood it.
Interpretation. Yeah.
What a great read into that.
Yeah, I think there was one quote that we should talk about that just felt really important, and like a, you know, pretty big societal aspect of what's going on here. It was that no one asks about the root causes of heterosexuality or cisgenderism. And she talks about that a couple times, about going into like trying to figure out why someone is trans, or trying to figure out why someone is gay, or, you know, well, yeah. So I mean, I just feel like that's a very important conversation in itself, because it, you know, the Catholic Church for a long time was looking for the gay gene, and it's always with the understanding that they want to fix it. We do this with the autistic community too. We want to fix autism, so we're trying to figure out what causes it so that we can prevent it.
For sure. Would you mind reading that quote one more time?
Yeah. So no one asks about the root causes of heterosexuality or cisgenderism. Cyborg politics is the struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication, against the one code that translates all meaning perfectly, the central dogma. Yet it seems that we are forever stuck whirling around the idea that queerness was caused. And that was from Karen Barad, the physicist, that she talks about with the cyborg theory.
I think it's the discussion that heterosexuality or cisgenderism or cisgender identity is the default, and everything outside of that is other. And I think the reason that no one asks about the root causes of the either two is because we have created this system that has a standard or has a default, and anything other than that is odd or outside of the norm. And that is the way that we've created this power dynamic between people.
Yeah, I mean, they say 20% of, I think it's millennials and Gen Z are identifying as not cis or not straight, and that's not a small number. So for that to be, for us to still consider the default just cisgender and just straight, and not look into it any further, and like you said, you have to come out as a gay person. You don't get to just like, that doesn't get to just be the default. You have to come out to your family, you have to come out to your coworkers and your friends and everything. You have to put it out there, and that it's not a small enough number for that to have to be the default situation.
Do you all think there's a, go ahead.
I think it's important to also recognize that this is a very Western topic and a very Western idea about queer identity and stuff like this. So like when we're speaking in these generalized terms about, you know, millennials or things like that, Western millennials, I think it's really important that like Eastern cultures as well as Native and Indigenous cultures have trans identity, but they often refer to it as a third gender. and it's very much more respected in a different culture
Mm.
than what it is in like American or Westernized culture.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a way to explore etiology without coming from a pathological framework, or do you think it's worthwhile to even explore etiology in regard to trans identity?
I think it's important to explore trans identity just because we haven't explored trans identity enough. And I think that we don't have enough trans scholars researching trans. I mean, we have plenty of trans scholars researching trans identity. The problem is what has made it into the mainstream and what has been absorbed by people is research from cisgender scholars about trans people. So they're telling it from a non-trans perspective about trans experience. And it's confusing, I think. And sometimes it gets shifted into a narrative that's easily digestible by the person who's supposed to be receiving it.
Gotcha.
Right, because oftentimes trans research is not meant to be for trans people to better understand themselves. It's for other people to understand whatever topic is being studied or researched better. Right, it's written for audiences. It's done for a specific purpose.
And I think you can explore the trauma of someone without directly relating it to what, to a outcome. You can look at somebody's trauma and somebody's, codependency in their background without saying that it directly caused their transness or that it was an aspect of their transness.
I just want to close with that. Like, I don't think that there's anything that causes people to be trans or queer or anything. I mean, that's the same thing as saying like there's something that causes people to be Black or causes people to be Indigenous. You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, there is something that causes, but when we start making it seem like there's differing biological factors that causes these types of things, it's where we get into that debate of like the superior race type thing, is where we start getting into that eugenics conversation.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's where the Catholic Church wanted to take it.
I wonder if kind of the concern about using the word and talking about like, cause and correlation and all of that, I wonder if our concern is that that's going to put us in a place of, like superiority and eugenics, because that's been such our experience. But when we, start talking about biological differences in regard to, race, it gets into, there's a fear there that that's going to result in us saying, okay, well, that's, if we can say that Black people are different from white people in this way, then we can start determining which are the better traits to have. That's
you
all.
you get into that fear with like, where you talk about sickle cell, and with conditions like that, gene manipulation sounds like such a grand idea because you're trying to make people's lives better. Chronic illnesses and stuff like that, that is something that gene manipulation is going to be used for and should be used for. But I think it is, like you're saying, that fear of this becoming a way to wipe out an entire culture essentially, and being used to make everybody more white and more cis and more straight, and make it the way that people think it should be, so to speak.
And I'm not suggesting that we should get over that fear or not address that. I think that's a real fear, and we have to be responsible about the real results that can come from researching or having certain conversations in certain spaces. I think that's important. So I don't have the answer for how we should address it, but I think it's important to explore and study, and I'm just interested in truth. And I feel like we can all be better for that. And there's still a way to approach people in a compassionate manner. And I don't know, I think you can do, I don't know. I'm in an I don't know place about that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very real fear. It's the idea that they would justify it the exact same way and say, we're doing it to make your life better. It's the exact same as getting rid of sickle cell. We're doing it to make your life better, but in reality, like the deaf community talks about it a lot. They don't want a cure for deafness, so to speak. They want people that want that option to have that option, but they have an entire culture and they don't want their culture wiped out. Like a lot of deaf people, you know, that even got cochlear implants as a child choose not to wear it as an adult because they want to be part of that culture that they felt excluded from as a child because they had their implant now. But, you know, it's that idea of we want to cure those otherness and to make people's lives better, so to speak. But really, we're just wiping out what makes us more human.
I want to say two things. I want to say on the conversation, it kind of made me nervous when you asked that question, just because I was thinking about it a lot. And I was thinking about a professor I had who kind of was saying, will always remind us, you know, with information, there's a responsibility to that. And that's so real. That is so real. When we inform ourselves of things, when we're doing these research, there is a level of responsibility because it's not only just with accuracy, just how we handle that information. What do we do with it? And that's really concerning because ultimately that's at the hands of the people with the research and also the people who have the power to do something about that. So that's really nerve-wracking. So yeah, that made me super nervous when you said that, because I was like, oh, you're so right.
And me too. Because the reality is that regardless of whether we're the most informed person, regardless of whether we have all the knowledge, we will be impacted by the things we're talking about, right? And so I think it's worthwhile to have a space where, you know, lay people, so to speak, can come together and talk about things that affect us. I so enjoyed this conversation with you all. I thought it was so helpful, so meaningful. And important topics to explore and to continue to learn about, even just the four of us. There are a lot of things, blind spots that I recognize that I had, that I'm coming to terms with and grappling in this moment. And so I'm really thankful to you all for that.
Thank you all so much for journeying with us today. Be sure to check out our description box below for the page numbers we cover in our next meeting. Want to get in on the discussion? Be sure to check out our comment section where we pose questions to our community, and we love to hear from you too. Can't wait to connect with you soon. Journey well.